Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Tonight, we're taking you to The Hague, where history is unfolding in real time. The International Criminal Court has begun hearings for former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, and the scenes outside that courtroom tell a story the world needs to hear.
This is a moment that human rights advocates have fought for over the better part of a decade. A former head of state, who openly bragged about killing drug suspects, now sitting before an international tribunal. Outside, protesters are making sure the world doesn't look away.
We've been digging into the details of these hearings, the legal strategy, the political fallout, and the voices of the thousands of Filipino families who lost loved ones in Duterte's so-called war on drugs. This is not just a legal proceeding. This is a reckoning.
So stay with us, because tonight we're going deep. We're following the money, the power, and the bodies. This is Truth Report. Let's get to work.
We begin tonight at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Netherlands, where proceedings have officially opened against former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, human rights activists marched outside the ICC as hearings got underway, demanding accountability for what many have called one of the deadliest state-sponsored campaigns against civilians in modern Southeast Asian history.
Let's set the stage here. Rodrigo Duterte served as president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022. During that time, he launched what he called a war on drugs, a campaign that, according to human rights organizations, resulted in the extrajudicial killing of thousands of Filipinos. The Philippine government's own figures put the death toll at over 6,000. Independent watchdogs and investigators say the real number could be anywhere from 12,000 to over 30,000.
And that gap between the official figure and the estimated reality is itself part of the story. For years, the Duterte administration systematically underreported killings, classified victims as drug suspects killed while resisting arrest, and intimidated journalists and human rights workers who tried to document what was actually happening on the ground. The phrase used repeatedly in police reports was nanlaban, meaning the suspect fought back. It became a dark euphemism that everyone understood.
The ICC's involvement goes back years. The court's former chief prosecutor, Fatu Bensouda, opened a preliminary examination into the situation in the Philippines in February 2018. Her successor, Karim Khan, authorized a formal investigation in June 2021. Duterte's response at the time was to withdraw the Philippines from the Rome Statute, the treaty that established the ICC. That withdrawal took effect in March 2019, but critically, the court retained jurisdiction over crimes committed while the Philippines was still a member state.
That's a crucial legal point. Duterte tried to slam the door shut on international accountability, but the ICC's jurisdiction covers the period from November 2011, when the Rome Statute entered into force for the Philippines, through March 2019. That window covers the bulk of the drug war killings. Duterte couldn't retroactively escape the court's reach, no matter how loudly he protested.
And protest he did. For years, Duterte mocked the ICC, called it useless, said he would never cooperate, and even joked publicly about being willing to go to prison. He once told reporters, and I quote, "I will never, never, never answer to a foreign court." He framed the ICC investigation as Western imperialism, as foreign interference in Philippine sovereignty. It was a playbook we've seen from other leaders facing international prosecution.
But here's what changed. The political landscape in the Philippines shifted. Duterte left office in June 2022, and while his successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., initially maintained the country's non-cooperation stance with the ICC, domestic political dynamics have evolved. Duterte and Marcos had a falling out, and the current administration has been less aggressive in shielding Duterte from international scrutiny. Reports indicate that behind-the-scenes diplomatic negotiations led to conditions under which these hearings could move forward.
Let's talk about what the ICC is actually examining. The charges center on crimes against humanity, specifically murder, as part of a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population. Prosecutors allege that the drug war was not a legitimate law enforcement operation but a state policy designed to eliminate suspected drug users and dealers without due process. Police officers were allegedly given quotas, rewarded for kills, and operated with complete impunity.
The evidence that has been compiled is staggering. Witness testimony from former police officers who participated in the killings. Forensic evidence contradicting official police narratives. Documentation from Philippine human rights organizations like Karapatan and I Defend. Reports from international bodies including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Photographic and video evidence. And the testimony of surviving family members, many of them from the poorest communities in Manila, Cebu, and Davao.
That last point deserves emphasis. The victims of Duterte's drug war were overwhelmingly poor. They came from urban slums and impoverished rural areas. They were rickshaw drivers, street vendors, day laborers. Many had no documented connection to the drug trade at all. This was a campaign that targeted the most vulnerable, the people with the least power to fight back and the fewest resources to seek justice. The wealthy and connected drug figures, by and large, were not the ones turning up dead in alleyways.
Human Rights Watch documented case after case where police fabricated evidence, planted weapons and drugs on victims' bodies, and filed false reports claiming suspects resisted arrest. In one particularly well-documented pattern, police would conduct nighttime operations in poor neighborhoods, drag individuals from their homes, and execute them on the street. Neighbors who witnessed these killings were terrorized into silence. Families who spoke up faced threats and, in some cases, were themselves targeted.
And this is where the protests outside the ICC become so significant. According to Al Jazeera's coverage, the activists who marched outside the court represent a broad coalition of human rights defenders, church groups, and families of victims. For these families, many of whom have been fighting for accountability since 2016, seeing Duterte face an international court is a moment they were told would never come. Some of them traveled from the Philippines to The Hague to be present, to bear witness.
I want to highlight one dimension of this that often gets lost in the legal and political analysis. The psychological toll on Filipino communities has been immense. A generation of children grew up watching their parents or neighbors dragged away and killed. Communities lived under a reign of terror where anyone could be accused, and accusation effectively meant a death sentence. Mental health professionals in the Philippines have documented widespread trauma, depression, and anxiety in communities most affected by the drug war. These hearings are not just about legal accountability. They are about acknowledging that suffering.
Now let's examine the political machinery that enabled this. Duterte didn't operate alone. The drug war had institutional support from the Philippine National Police, which carried out the operations. It had political support from allies in Congress who blocked investigations. It had media support from a propaganda apparatus that dehumanized drug users, portraying them as subhuman threats to society. And it had popular support, at least initially, from a public exhausted by crime and seduced by promises of order.
That popular support is something we need to grapple with honestly. When Duterte took office in 2016, his approval ratings were extraordinarily high. Polls showed majority support for the drug war, even as the bodies piled up. This tells us something uncomfortable about how authoritarian violence can be marketed and sold to democratic publics. Duterte positioned himself as the tough father figure who would clean up the nation, and millions bought it. The question of how democratic societies can be led to support mass killing is one that extends far beyond the Philippines.
It's a pattern we see globally. A charismatic strongman identifies a vulnerable population, dehumanizes them, convinces the public that extreme measures are necessary, and then uses state power to carry out violence while maintaining democratic legitimacy. Duterte studied this playbook, and he executed it with ruthless efficiency. The parallels to other authoritarian movements around the world are impossible to ignore.
Let's also follow the money, because the drug war had an economic dimension that rarely gets discussed. Resources that could have been directed toward public health, addiction treatment, and poverty alleviation were instead funneled into police operations. Officers involved in killings received bonuses and promotions. Meanwhile, the actual drug trade was barely disrupted. Independent analyses have shown that methamphetamine use in the Philippines did not significantly decline during the drug war years. The violence was performative. It served political purposes, not public health ones.
And who benefited politically? Duterte used the drug war to consolidate power, neutralize political opponents, and build a cult of personality. Critics were accused of being drug protectors. Journalists who investigated the killings, most notably Maria Ressa and her team at Rappler, faced criminal charges and harassment. Senator Leila de Lima, who led a congressional investigation into the killings, was arrested on drug charges that were widely seen as politically motivated and spent years in detention. The drug war was not just about drugs. It was about power.
Maria Ressa's case is worth underscoring. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021 for her courageous journalism, and her persecution by the Duterte government became an international symbol of the threats facing press freedom worldwide. Rappler's documentation of the drug war killings was meticulous and brave, and it came at enormous personal cost to Ressa and her journalists. Without their work, and the work of other Filipino journalists who risked everything, the evidentiary record before the ICC would be far thinner.
Now, the legal proceedings themselves. ICC hearings are complex and can take years. What's happening now is an initial phase where the court examines whether there is sufficient basis to proceed. The defense is expected to challenge jurisdiction, argue that the Philippines had adequate domestic legal processes, and contest the characterization of the drug war as a systematic policy. These are standard legal arguments, but in this case, they ring particularly hollow given Duterte's own public statements.
And that's one of the most remarkable aspects of this case. Duterte was not subtle. He publicly and repeatedly boasted about killing. He told audiences he had personally killed criminal suspects when he was mayor of Davao City. He encouraged police to shoot drug suspects and promised to pardon officers who faced charges. He said he would be happy to slaughter 3 million drug addicts and compared his campaign to the Holocaust, saying he would be happy to butcher them. These are not allegations from hostile witnesses. These are Duterte's own words, on camera, in front of audiences, repeated over and over.
That kind of evidence from the accused's own mouth is extraordinary in international criminal proceedings. Typically, prosecutors have to build circumstantial cases connecting leaders to crimes carried out by subordinates. With Duterte, the challenge is almost the opposite. There is an embarrassment of direct evidence of intent. The question for the court is how to process the sheer volume of self-incriminating statements alongside the physical evidence of thousands of killings.
Let's broaden the lens for a moment and place this in the context of international justice more broadly. The ICC has faced persistent criticism that it disproportionately targets African leaders while powerful nations escape scrutiny. The Duterte case, involving a leader from Southeast Asia, alongside more recent warrants involving other global actors, represents a potential evolution for the court. If the ICC can successfully prosecute a former president for crimes against his own people carried out under the banner of law enforcement, it sets a precedent with implications worldwide.
That precedent matters enormously because the tactics Duterte used are not unique to the Philippines. In Brazil, El Salvador, Bangladesh, and other countries, leaders have launched aggressive anti-crime campaigns that human rights organizations say have resulted in widespread extrajudicial killings. If the ICC establishes that a war on drugs or a war on gangs cannot be used as legal cover for state-sponsored murder, it creates a framework for accountability that could protect vulnerable populations globally.
At the same time, we should be clear-eyed about the limitations. The ICC has no police force. It relies on state cooperation to enforce its rulings. Even if Duterte is ultimately convicted, enforcement depends on political will. And the court's track record on enforcement is mixed at best. But the symbolic and normative power of these proceedings should not be underestimated. For the families of the dead, for the human rights defenders who were threatened and jailed, for the journalists who were persecuted, these hearings represent a validation that the world was watching and that the world cares.
I want to return to those protesters outside the ICC, because their presence tells us something vital. These are people who refuse to be silenced. For years, they documented killings, comforted grieving families, pressured international institutions, and kept the flame of accountability alive when it seemed like the world had moved on. They did this at great personal risk, in a country where human rights defenders were being murdered. Their presence in The Hague is not just a political statement. It is a testament to the power of sustained, courageous advocacy.
And their demands go beyond Duterte personally. They are calling for systemic accountability, for the police officers who pulled the triggers, the officials who gave the orders, and the political system that enabled the killings. They want truth commissions, reparations for victims' families, and institutional reforms to prevent anything like this from happening again. The ICC proceedings are one piece of a much larger justice puzzle that the Philippines will need to assemble.
Let's also note the generational dimension. Young Filipinos who grew up during the drug war years are now coming of age politically. Many of them lost family members or grew up in communities devastated by the violence. How they process this history, whether through accountability and healing or through denial and repetition, will shape the Philippines for decades. These ICC hearings are, in a very real sense, about what kind of future the Philippines will build.
There's a broader lesson here about democratic backsliding and the fragility of human rights protections. The Philippines had a functioning democracy, a free press, and an independent judiciary. Yet a single charismatic leader was able to weaponize populist anger, undermine institutional checks, and carry out mass violence with broad public support. If it can happen in the Philippines, it can happen anywhere. That is not hyperbole. It is a warning grounded in documented reality.
And the international community's response during the worst of the killings was, frankly, inadequate. While some governments and international bodies raised concerns, the response was largely diplomatic throat-clearing while thousands were being murdered. The United States, under the Trump administration, was notably warm toward Duterte. Economic and strategic interests in the region consistently trumped human rights concerns. The ICC proceedings happening now are, in part, a consequence of the international community's failure to act when it mattered most.
That failure of real-time intervention is something that should haunt policymakers. The killings were not secret. They were broadcast, bragged about, documented in real time by journalists and human rights workers. The international community had the information. What was lacking was the political will to act. The lesson is stark. International human rights norms mean nothing if powerful nations choose to look the other way when those norms are violated by strategic allies.
Let's now pull the threads together and look at the bigger picture. What we're witnessing in The Hague is more than one man's legal reckoning. It's a test case for whether international justice can hold powerful leaders accountable for violence against their own citizens. It's a referendum on whether the phrase, "never again," has any operational meaning, or whether it's just words we recite after atrocities while doing nothing to prevent the next one.
The patterns we see in the Duterte case, the dehumanization of a vulnerable population, the weaponization of law enforcement, the suppression of press freedom, the intimidation of political opposition, these patterns are repeating in different forms around the world right now. The question is whether the international community will learn from the Philippine experience or continue to react only after the damage is done.
And at the heart of it all are the victims. Real people with names, families, dreams. Kian de los Santos, a 17-year-old student dragged from his home and shot by police in 2017, whose death sparked outrage because CCTV footage contradicted the police account. His case became a symbol, but behind that symbol were thousands of similar stories that never made headlines, thousands of families whose grief was compounded by the knowledge that their government considered their loved ones disposable.
The courage of those families, many of whom have continued to speak out despite threats and intimidation, is the most powerful force in this story. They are the ones who kept the pressure on when institutions failed them. They are the ones who brought their testimony to international investigators. They are the ones standing outside the ICC right now, demanding that the world see what was done in their name and in the name of public safety.
So what happens next? The ICC proceedings will continue. Legal arguments will be made. Evidence will be presented. This will take time, likely years. But the proceedings themselves are already having an impact. They are sending a message to current and future leaders that bragging about killing your own citizens, no matter how popular it makes you at home, can eventually catch up with you. That deterrent effect, however imperfect, matters.
And for those watching from countries where similar tactics are being employed, these hearings offer both a warning and a hope. A warning that the arc of justice, while long and often maddeningly slow, does sometimes bend toward accountability. And a hope that the voices of the powerless, the ones who are told their lives don't matter, can ultimately be heard in the highest courts of international law.
Before we close, let's be direct about what the evidence shows. This was not a war on drugs. It was a war on the poor, conducted by a government that used the language of law and order to justify mass murder. The ICC hearings are an opportunity to name that reality clearly and to ensure it is recorded in the formal annals of international justice. Whatever the legal outcome, the historical record must be clear.
The protesters outside the ICC understand this. They're not just seeking a conviction. They're seeking recognition. Recognition that what happened was wrong. Recognition that the victims were human beings who deserved the protection of law, not its violence. Recognition that accountability is not optional when a state turns its machinery of power against its own people.
And that brings us to our final point tonight. Accountability is never automatic. It requires courage, persistence, and the refusal to accept impunity as normal. The Filipino human rights defenders, journalists, and families who have fought for this moment for nearly a decade embody that refusal. Their struggle is far from over, but these hearings represent a milestone that many thought would never come.
The story of Duterte's drug war, and now his appearance before the ICC, is ultimately a story about what we value as a global community. Do we value order over justice? Do we value sovereignty over human life? Do we accept that some populations are expendable if a leader can frame their elimination as necessary? The answers we give to those questions, not just in courtrooms but in our politics, our media, and our daily lives, will determine whether the next Duterte succeeds or is stopped.
To the families of the victims, to the activists who never gave up, to the journalists who risked their freedom to report the truth, we see you. This story is not over. Truth Report will continue to follow these proceedings and hold every institution involved to account.
That's our show for tonight. We covered one story, but as you can see, it contains multitudes. The ICC hearings for Rodrigo Duterte are about the Philippines, but they're also about all of us. About what we're willing to tolerate, what we're willing to fight for, and whether justice is something we practice or just something we preach.
If this reporting matters to you, share it. Talk about it. Stay informed. The best defense against authoritarian violence is a public that refuses to look away.
I'm Maya Clarity.
And I'm Alex Truth. Thanks for watching. Stay vigilant, and we'll see you next time on Truth Report.